Welcome, everybody, to Junction Reads. This is our final virtual Junction Reads of the season. And Sarah Louise Butler, I'm so grateful that you're joining us here. Welcome, everyone who's joining us in the waiting room, and to anyone who's listening to this after the event. Thank you. We open with a land acknowledgement as a reminder that we exist here in a country now called Canada because of the colonial actions of the settlers who came before us. Reconciliation requires more than this acknowledgement. We must consistently and mindfully recognize our colonial history and accept the responsibility to care for the land, its resources, and all the people who were here before us. Colonialism, occupation, and genocide should not be an acceptable part of our collective histories. Junction Reads exists in what is currently called Toronto on the treaty land of the Mississaugas of the Credit. It includes the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wyandot peoples. Sarah Louise Butler joins us from the unceded territory of the Sinixt, the Tunaka, and the Silka people in a place now called Nelson, BC. We recognize the continued displacement and colonization of First Nations people across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to work in the community on their territory. Sarah, once again, thank you for joining us. I
Thank you
would
so much
love
for having me.
Thanks. I would love for you to share with everybody what you're reading right now or a favorite book, a recommended book to add to our TBR, our big TBR piles.
I'm on a little bit of a self-imposed book buying timeout right now. But luckily, I have a tiny free library in front of my house. So I've been kind of reading things that pop up in there that aren't necessarily my usual genre. And I've just
Nice.
started a book, and I'm not sure if it's one I would recommend, but instead, I would love to recommend the last really good book I did read. It's called Milk Teeth. And it's a hybrid memoir by Raya Liebig, and the subtitle is Becoming a Mother Through Loss and Rediscovery. And as someone who writes novels, I just find the hybrid form so interesting. So yes, I highly, highly recommend Milk Tea Book.
Very nice. I love that. I am going to share links and stuff in the chat when Sarah Louise starts her reading. But for now, I'm going to share your bio with everyone, if that's okay.
Of course.
Sarah Louise Butler is a novelist based in the West Kootenay region of the BC interior. With a background in physical geography and environmental studies, her stories seek to portray natural landscapes and their non-human inhabitants as characters in their own right. Her debut novel, The Wild Heavens, was a 49th Shelf Book of the Year and a favorite of book clubs and libraries across the country, including being chosen as a Vancouver Public Library Top 20 Favorite Book of 2020. It was recently translated and released in France. Kaylee Butler was named a CBC Writer to Watch in 2020. Rufous and Calliope is her second book, and it was just shortlisted for the Ethel Wilson Fiction Prize, a BC and Yukon Book Award. And you can find Sarah Louise Butler on Instagram at sarahlouise.butler. Sarah, I'm excited for you to read.
And so here is my book. And because, of course, with the novel, it's easiest to start at the beginning. And so the story moves through time. My main character, Rufus, is 5 years old at the start of the story, and later we catch up with him through different points in his life. But in the bits that I'm going to read from now, it's from the prologue and first chapter, and he's 5 years old, or he's just about 50 years old. So I think you'll be able to tell which is which, and hopefully get a bit of a sense of how the way that the novel kind of moves through time. So first, I'm going to read to you from the prologue. Our last night in the treehouse began with us running through the dark streets in our costumes, knocking on front doors and flinging open our plastic bags for the backlit strangers with their bowls of brightly wrapped candy. I gawked at each treasure that was dropped in before Fawn sang her thank you and Calliope shouted hers and I whispered mine, and we raced off to the next door. Our sister Fletch and our brother Sylve slouched along behind us in their jeans and jean jackets, sharing smokes on the sidewalk through their dime store skeleton masks. I'd rarely been to town, and never in the dark. The sky was huge, the mountains distant. Carved pumpkins glowed like beacons outside each front door. Streetlights poured round puddles of light into the wood smoke scented night, and in the darkness between them, I grabbed Fawn's hand. Is it like this every night? I asked. My second oldest sister shook her head. I wish. Calliope shouted, Rufus, come on, and I let go of Fawn's sugar-sticky hand to chase after my twin sister, the pavement hard under the thin soles of my sneakers. Calliope's angel gown billowed around her, Fawn's clown mask slipped down over her eyes, and the tail on my fox costume swung wildly as we ran from door to door, our steps buoyed by the unfamiliar weightlessness of blending into a crowd of children, of nobody questioning who we were, where we lived, just who exactly was supposed to be taking care of us. When our bags were heavy and the streets began to empty, the five of us slipped from the edge of town, past the faded welcome sign and the graffitied grain elevator, and into the night. So I'm going to read, now just a couple bits from chapter 1. The treehouse was built between the trunks of 3 mature cedars. 15 feet off the ground, it was accessed by a rope and board ladder we pulled up each night. We slept crowded together in musty secondhand sleeping bags. We ate rainbow trout and marked down lunch meat and wild berries and day-old donuts. The cedar bark was soft and feathery. The tree's lower reaches were patched with moss. A chickadee made her nest inside a cavity in one of the trunks. Her babies hatched and grew and fledged and flew away. Squirrels called out their staccato alarms whenever any of us came or went from the treehouse. In all those months, they never got used to us. It was 1979, and just over 100 kilometers from where I now stand at the western end of this roadless mountain pass. From the warm unfurling of early summer to the first frosts of autumn, 5 children were cradled in the palm of those towering trees. My 15-year-old sister Fletcher, my 14-year-old brother Silver, my sister Fawn, who turned 10 that July, my 5-year-old self, a tiny anxious scrap of a boy, and my slightly taller, infinitely braver twin sister, Calliope. Through the trees, I can see the Caribou Pass historical trail marker I found last night, just as dusk was falling. This route is unmaintained and contains many hazards, the bullet-scarred sign notes. Travel is not recommended. Desiccated moss crunches under my boots as I walk through the fringed skirts of the cedars, over a dried-up creek bed, and onto the trail. We found you in a cookie tin floating down the river, my brother Sylve said. He was lounging on a blue foam mat in the treehouse. Rain fell heavily, drumming on the swollen particle board roof, plinking into the empty soup cans we'd set out under the leaks. You did not, I said. Their faces looked serious, but I'd recently begun to grasp the complicated notion that my much older siblings could speak anything but truth. I glanced over at my twin sister Calliope, but for once, she didn't know any more than I did. Okay, for real though, Fletch said. I was fishing for rainbows and I hooked you through your shirt collar. I told her to put you back because you weren't in season, Sylve said. That's not what happened, Fawn said. What happened is, you flew right into a window and banged your head, and I picked you up and put you in a shoebox, and you slept for 3 whole days. Then you woke up and you started flapping around, but you didn't fly away. Okay, but seriously, Sylve said. You sprouted up in a cluster of morels. We would have fried you in butter and had you with eggs, but you didn't look very, appetizing. They're both full of shit, Fletch said. Sylve threw a pillow at her, and she batted it away. A few stray downy feathers drifted down to her feet. An osprey caught you in the river, and she was flying back to her nest to feed you to her babies. But an eagle started chasing her, and you slipped out of her talons while she was dodging it. And I ran over while you were falling, and I got there just in time to catch you. She acted out her role as well as she could in the small space of the treehouse, diving like an outfielder, sliding across the floor on her sleeping bag for the catch. I watched her performance, tried it on against my loosely formed sense of myself. There I was, falling helplessly toward a messy end, but instead I was caught neatly in my oldest sister's hands, turned over and examined like a river stone, slipped into a pocket to take home. That's what happened, I announced. Fletch retrieved her bottle of pop and lifted it in a toast to the room. Then there was a loud clap of thunder, and I flinched, and Calliope laughed and hit me with a pillow. We didn't need to be quiet. The storm was so loud, nobody would find us today. There was too much excitement to keep inside me, and I started jumping, and Fletch told me to stop because I'd break right through the floor. Or even worse, spill somebody's Dr. Pepper. So I leapt onto my brother and tried to wrestle him to the ground while he pretended to be helpless against my efforts. Fawn and Calliope kept hitting us both with our Salvation Army pillows. Feathers and fluff hung in the air around us. Sylve let me knock him right over, and as we fell together, he held me up above him so I didn't hit the ground. I'm going to read just one more short section. This is from the very end of the first chapter. Now I continue on, past huge mossy stumps and empty huckleberry bushes, with that song Sylve used to play on his guitar stuck in my head. It's a Pink Floyd classic, but that summer when I was 5, I really thought it was his song with its heroes and ghosts, its hot ashes and trees. Even years later, when I first heard it on the radio and realized my mistake, I couldn't help searching in the background for him, for his rough adolescent voice that was never going to stay that way, no matter what happened. He was 9 years older than me, and that summer I believed he could do anything. Right up to the end, I thought all of them could. Fletch in her black and white Zeppelin and Sabbath shirts, and her faded jeans that used to be Sylve's, her short black hair and dark blue-gray eyes. Sylve in his jean jacket with the sleeves cut off over his teenage biceps, his straight black hair cut short in the front and grown long in the back, feathering down onto his shoulders. Fawn with her long yellow hair and round blue eyes, her red windbreaker that came down to her knees and its overly long sleeves that wouldn't stay rolled up. And Calliope with her Superman t-shirt and Blue Jays ball cap and patched knee jeans just like mine. Our loose chestnut curls cut roughly short with the scissors on Fletch's pocket knife. Our matching dark eyes always on our older siblings, studying the topography of their every expression. Fletcher, Silver, Fawn, Rufus, Calliope. Same mother, 3 different fathers. Our clothes carrying the scent of the river we washed them in. All 5 of us with holes in the heels and the soles and the toes of our sneakers. Do the separate continents mourn the memory of Pangea? If they somehow bumped up against each other again, would they remember the time when they were united? Or maybe they didn't all survive the breakup. Maybe the smallest among them drowned in the violent wake of the others rushing away. Now the sun has cleared the mountains. It hangs in the smoky sky, a crisply defined red ball. A child's balloon slipped through careless fingers. Ahead of me, the mountains stretch into the distance, successively fading away into the smoke. A towering western hemlock set back in the forest stretches its limbs almost to the edge of the trail. As I pass by, I reach out and brush my fingers companionably over the ends of each bough in turn. Good game, good game, good game. Still, ash falls from the sky as I walk. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Oh my gosh. My first question has to be about the siblings. It was as one of 5 kids that that scene, that knowing them, all of them in this treehouse in the middle of nowhere, like runaways. Um, it was really the most attractive introduction to a book I've read in a really long time. And so I want to talk to you about those siblings, the natural way that they exist together, the love, the humor, the poking fun at each other, but also the intensity of care that happens among them all. When did they all come to you, and how did you know it was going to be a story that included every single one of them?
Mhm. I like there. I feel like there are. I read a lot of books that focus on like love relation, like romantic love or parent-child relationships, and that's not a criticism. Like my own first book also focused on those two types of relationships, but for this one, I really wanted to focus on siblings because I think it's not explored as often in fiction. And for myself, I'm the third of four, and I'm Gen X. So I grew up at a time when parents were a little more in the background of our daily lives in a lot of cases, in a different way than is the case now, I think. And so my siblings, and also to some extent the other kids in the neighborhood, especially the older kids, played this enormous role in my early years. And yeah, it really did feel like a lot of our days was just like a pack of kids running around. And I think with this book, I wanted to sort of evoke those the children's books that so many avid readers as adults were often avid readers as children. And
Hmm.
I really love the way that in those books it was the adults were kind of absent. It was a pack of kids. They had to solve some sort of adventure or like solve a mystery or go on some sort of quest. And yeah, I wanted to sort of evoke some of that, but also I didn't see myself writing like young adult or children's books per se. So I wanted to take that and then sort of make a book for adults out of it.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, the scenes with all the siblings as children were actually also my favorite to write. And there is a lot of my own family in there. Part of the reason I needed to have five of them was because if I had four, they might have tracked too neatly onto my
Right.
own family, which I did put a lot of family lore in the story, but I didn't want it to be super obvious. So yeah, that's why five.
Right. I love that. Also Gen X and read Enid Blyton's Book of Five.
Mhm.
And I remember when Kaylee was little and giving them those books to read and the unbelievable, like, oh, there's no way those kids were doing that, and it's like,
Yeah,
yes, they were like all by themselves for real doing that.
yeah,
I love
yeah.
that so much. And memory, I mean, the reason Rufus goes on this journey, there is so much. Anyone listening to this right now, coming up with these questions, I honestly I have to insert spoiler, 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 spoiler. This book is a genius of conservation and revelation. And so, forgive me if my questions are being asked very slowly and methodically, but um, remembering is a big thing for Rufus. He's got early onset memory loss, whether it's dementia or not. I sort of felt like it wasn't quite clear, but he's trying to remember a before time. He's trying to remember a lot of things from his childhood and whether those memories are in fact real things that happened, if he remembered them correctly. And it's kind of brought home this feeling of all that we lose just in growing up, right? Like from kids to adults, it's not necessarily the memory loss. It's losing memory, losing memories. And so I want you to talk about that a little bit, that sort of heartbreaking loss of time, really, of
Mhm.
those experiences.
Yeah, I was thinking about how we don't remember the first few years of our lives,
Mhm.
but we're told those stories if we're lucky by siblings or parents or other people. But really, the reason I got so much into memory and especially memory loss has to do with my maternal grandmother had a severe and never precisely diagnosed form of very early onset dementia.
Right.
And she lived with that through my entire childhood. Some of my earliest memories are of being in the nursing home she had dementia, but virtually everyone else in the place did as well. And yeah, one of my really early memories is my younger brother learning how to walk, holding on to the railings in the big wide hallways that they had. And at the same time that he was learning how to walk, my grandmother was forgetting how to walk.
Right.
And yeah, so she was a really big influence in my life, even though she already had quite advanced dementia by my earliest memories. But we had sort of this unusual connection in that all the relatives on my mom's side, including my mother, were always telling me how much I looked like her. And I
Wow.
was a little kid. I mean, she wasn't very old. She was maybe in her 60s, but of course I couldn't see this resemblance. But there was a time when someone pulled out some old black and white photos of her as a child. And I still remember the moment of seeing those. And I am sure other people have experienced this, but
Mhm.
there's a very eerie feeling to looking at a black and white photo and seeing your own face looking
Mhm.
at you in old-fashioned clothing. And um, it's sort of, yeah, I think because I had that experience when I was maybe not quite old enough to be totally rational or logical, it kind of gave me this idea, more of a fear that I was somehow destined to share her
Right.
fate. And as I got older, and that's not rational, my mother's in her 80s and she's still very sharp. Her sister's in her 90s and is still very sharp. There's no rational reason for me to think I'm any more likely than anyone else
Hmm.
to suffer this condition, but there's some part of me that is still kind of has that
Hmm.
idea. And so, yeah, part of with this book, I was kind of working through that and also sort of making it a little bit more whimsical than the reality in some ways. But yeah, the reality of a classic Alzheimer's sort of presentation is something that was really familiar to me throughout my life. And in the way that when you experience something as a very young child, it does feel sort of normal in a way too.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's sort of where that bit of memory, that focus on memory came from.
I love that because there's a scene where Rufus is asking the older siblings about like the difference, they've each got different dads. I think it's Silver and Fawn have a dad, and Fletch has a dad, and Rufus and Calliope have a dad. And there is this kind of touching on the negatives of the mom, maybe, the reason why they're in the situation that they're in. But then there's also this moment of beauty, right? Like you're carrying with you so much of your grandmother. And even though there's this fear of what you're carrying, there's also just so much beauty. And I felt that with Rufus, even though he's carrying generalized anxiety disorder with a side of claustrophobia, as he calls it, he's also carrying so much else. So I'm grateful to that. I was hoping that you would talk about this thing that Rufus has, this idea that for his entire life he believed he had this chronic condition and is just coming into what he now realizes. And again, these are Rufus's words, is acute, but he's talking about life, right? He's talking about how his life is this acute um, hardship, this acute kind of pain. And I was hoping that you would share more about that.
Yeah, it's always interesting to see different like interpretations of things too, because in my mind, the acute part was all of it, like not just the hardship or the negative, but just sort of the idea that we do go through our days treating life as a
Mm.
chronic condition very often, and it is only in certain moments that we remember that this is actually an acute condition we're all in, like it's not going to
Yeah,
last
yeah.
forever. And so that's sort of what I was trying to get at with the idea. And yeah, Rufus has anxiety and a bit of claustrophobia. And um, the reason for that is that because I realize this is something that isn't super obvious outside of like maybe the area where I live or northern Canada, that I was trying to evoke the sense that living among wildfires creates in the community. And
Right.
so when the smoke is really heavy in town, or if there's fires nearby and our neighbors, people who live quite close by, are on evacuation notice or being evacuated, or it creates there's sort of a communal sense of there is an anxiety. There's an animal feeling that we should leave.
Yeah.
Some mornings you wake up and there's no bird song and it feels wrong to stay. We feel like we should go somewhere even though we don't know where that is. Often the highways are closed and it'd be hard to leave anyway. Um, and then there is also, because we're used to living around mountains and always seeing the mountains in every direction, when the smoke really comes in heavily, like for example, from my house, I look out the window and I see the mountains across the lake. And when the smoke's really heavy, I can't see any mountains.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm not sure if claustrophobia is like a perfect metaphor for it, but yeah, it's something like that. There's a strange feeling to it. It feels sort of wrong. It feels that things are closing in. And I really wanted Rufus to kind of represent those feelings that we have at that time. And yeah, the wildfires really are a really significant part of our lives here where I live. Like I had my book launch for Rufous and Calliope was in September. And I have one 20-year-old son, and he wasn't able to attend because he was up north fighting fires,
Oh,
like fighting
wow.
wildfires at the time of
Yeah.
my launch. And so this is just, yeah, it's just like very much a part of our lives. And I wanted to sort of evoke that. And so I talked about the smoke a lot, but I also wanted the reader to have a little bit of the feeling that sort of lives in Rufus of that anxiety, that claustrophobia. So that's sort of
Mhm.
why poor Rufus had to have both of these conditions, which I'm also personally familiar with as well. So
Right. Yeah. There was a feeling of an intimate attachment to it. But again,
yeah.
in that space, my daughter lived in Wells for a really long time, and she often talked about that feeling of like when there weren't fires, it was this like wide open space, and when there were
Mm,
fires, it was like cabin fever kind of
mhm.
feeling. But this word, and again, it was only in reading more about Rufus and Calliope and notes from the publisher that I heard ecological grief as a term. It was the first time I heard it. And just in reading it in relation to this book, and I read the thing after I read the book because I feel like if I read that before I read the book, it kind of skews me. But when I read ecological grief, I thought, man, that is exactly this. But I'd never heard it before. And so will you talk about that? That
Yeah.
you
I
mentioned
guess
mourning. That
Yeah, I think, I mean, I guess my first experience of what I now would call ecological grief was growing up near Lake Ontario. I actually grew up in a little village called Newcastle, Ontario. It's not as little anymore. It's about an hour east of Toronto. And we were on Lake Ontario. And yeah, I guess one of my earliest experiences of that was we used to catch frogs in this little marsh quite close to Lake Ontario. And I would go there. I think I was taking piano lessons nearby. So every time after my piano lessons, I would get to go and catch frogs for a while in the marsh with my little brother. And this was in the 80s. And there was a year when there weren't any more frogs. And I was very young. It was absolutely world shattering to me. I could not fathom how there could be no frogs in this spot where there had always been frogs. And my older sister taught me to read when I was quite young, and so I was reading the Toronto Star, and I was reading things that were I couldn't have possibly have really comprehended. But I was reading about acid rain, I was reading about all these things, and just the thought, even just the thought that humans might have somehow contributed to this was it really shook me up. I always think of it
Yeah.
as my own personal sort of silent spring moment. And I think in the way that these things imprint on you as small kids, yeah, that really stuck with me. And then I ended up, yeah, I went to University of Guelph later. I studied geography and environmental studies. I tree planted up in northern Alberta to put myself through school. And then for another several years after, I was a tree planting cook in northern Ontario up towards Moosonee, like north of kind of Kapuskasing and Hearst and Cochrane and all those places. Um, and then I moved out here. So I live in a town of 11,000 people in the interior. And when I want to go somewhere, I drive 4 hours to the nearest like significant airport. So we're pretty
Right.
remote and it's sort of, yeah, it's sort of a regular part of our life too. There's still a lot of active forestry, like we're in an active forestry area. And so it's happened quite a few times that I've had sort of a favorite spot that has ended up being logged. And they were big old cedars and just, yeah, just really beautiful spots. And it's really it's hard to explain the sort of grief that comes with that, especially if you didn't know it was coming and you go to the spot after maybe it's spring and you're like, oh, you go so excited to go back and just be there again. And then going back and it's just leveled.
Yeah.
And I mean, I say this as someone who worked for 8 years in the forestry industry as well. Even though it was the planting side of things, it's still, I was still part of that system too. And so and a lot of people here work in resources, so it's complicated. But yeah, there's just something about that feeling was more what I was trying to get at with it, just more so than anything particular. But yeah, it's a really particular form of grief, I guess. And also, as someone whose ancestors only came here less than 200 years ago, which is not very long at all,
Yeah.
I always, when I'm in that experience, I always think, and what if my family had been here for millennia? What would that feel like if I'd known this grove all that time? If there were ancestral stories about it, that always comes to me in that moment too. And so,
Mhm.
yeah, it's ecological grief is not a fun topic, but it's definitely one that's been very real in my life, and I think for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I thought about is that it's kind of like the grief of losing someone you love, that people don't really understand it until it happens to them. But
Mhm.
with ecological grief, we're kind of in this place where we can't say that, right? We can't say you're not going to understand this until it happens to you, because when it happens to you, it's going to be happening to all of us and it's going to be too
Mhm.
late. And yeah, we were talking to Liz Johnston about the fall down effect, which touched on similar themes. And I just think everybody needs to read a book like this, needs to read more so that we can understand and prevent that grief from happening to all of us. Um, Rufus is such a great character. And I want to talk to you. This is maybe going to be a weird question, and I apologize if it's a weird question. But facial and body difference is kind of important to me. But so Rufus has 9 fingers and a stub, and he's a short guy, having like stopped growing at some point in time. And not that shortness is body difference. I'm not shaming anybody. But I want to talk to you about that because he really is physically exceptional. And I want to talk to you about developing him as not just a person, but as like a physical creature.
Mhm. Yeah, Rufus, it's funny because some parts of his appearance did just sort of come to me as I'm like, this is just the sort of man I pictured him being.
Right.
I always pictured him being like short but not tiny, like not a like not slight particularly, but just like not super tall.
Hmm.
And yeah, the reason for the missing finger is there's a plot reason for that. So it has to do with, yeah, there's just like kind of a family story about that, is the reason for that being involved.
That's the
And
it's like
yeah,
every spoiler,
yeah.
spoiler, spoiler, spoiler. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I always just find it interesting how different characters sort of like I often will use the physical appearance of somebody I know, but then I will never also use their personality because that feels like I'm writing fiction. It just doesn't feel quite right. But I for some reason, I find it hard to completely just create a face out of thin air. Like I know people who are, illustrators or artists who can just like completely create a whole new face in their mind. And I don't really have that. I almost have to take a couple people I know and sort of merge them together
Hmm.
to create the physical person. But then, yeah, their personality will be like quite a different, will be unrelated to those people. So nobody will ever totally recognize themselves. Although, that said, I did use some people I know, I did use some names. I put the names of a couple of my favorite high school teachers in this book.
Oh, nice.
So yeah, so one of them is no longer with us, but one of them I think is currently reading it. So very soon he will get to the point and see that his family name has been used in the book. So yeah, I always find that's a question I like to ask other writers too, because it is interesting, like where do the characters come from? And
Hmm.
I've never had this experience that I've heard people say of like, oh, the characters just walked into my mind and started talking. Like that's never happened for me, but I'm still hoping maybe with my third book it'll I'll get to experience that. It sounds amazing. I would love that if it happened. But
That they all just exist in your
yeah,
head. Like,
sounds
yeah,
great.
yeah, exactly. So I've talked about this, the kind of spoiler underscore spoiler thing that exists basically from the beginning until practically the very end, which I loved because it it really suited that idea of memory, like that idea that when you're really trying to remember something and you're trying to remember it, you're trying to remember it, you're trying to remember it, and then finally it sort of pops into your head. I really liked that. But this book is structured, and I use the word conservation because I really do feel like that's how I felt as a reader who is a writer. That's how I sort of felt the revelations came, that moments were conserved because I don't like the idea that things are kind of deliberately held back because I feel like there's a bigger a bigger message at play. But I want to talk this very writerly question, how you mapped it out, like how you plotted those revelations and conservations.
Yeah, I actually, it was interesting. Like this book, my first book came out in March 2020. Not the best time to launch
Right.
a book. But then that meant I also started writing this one at the same time. And along with all of the, I'm worried about my elderly parents. Like there was a lot going on at that time, obviously. But one of the things for me is like so many other people, I started watching way too much TV and films,
Right.
which I really hadn't done. I'd been watching like kids shows with my son before that. I hadn't really gotten super into like modern television and how good it can be. And
Yeah.
um, so, yeah, I feel like I started to I was watching it for escapism, but also I was working on this new book, and I felt like I was sort of studying it, which I think as writers we sort of do with any
Yeah.
medium. But I hadn't really been doing that so much before with film and TV. So I was sort of studying the way that things are revealed and the way that things are unfolded and how the pace is so important because you don't want it to frustrate your reader, but you also don't want it to be an unsatisfying experience for them. So you
Mhm.
really do have to sort of like orchestrate the way that you're revealing things in a way that yeah, my first book it was structured in a completely different way and I didn't really have to grapple with that to the same extent. And so that was a really big learning curve for me with this one. And yeah, I would say I really studied those and also, again, to refer again to my tiny free library, it really saved me at that point because there was a point when the library is closed and you can only afford to buy so many books. They did have a takeout service at our local indie bookstores, but um, I was reading for whatever reason, my own tiny free library gets a lot of thrillers, which was
Oh,
not a genre I had given adequate respect to before this. And I really found some great ones, got super into it. And there were some things in there that I was like, I would love to learn how to incorporate a couple of these techniques into the kind of writing I just naturally gravitate towards, which is a bit more introspective. And so, yeah, it was a process, and I would say that's probably what took me like a while in writing this to sort of work out how I was going to do it. And then, of course, I didn't have anyone read this until quite far along, like I really had a fairly complete draft. So then I was just waiting to hear what their take would be if it had worked
right.
and if it all, if like the pace more than anything, because it's something that you really do need feedback from other people to get. So I made a few I refined a couple things based on that initial feedback, but mostly it did work. It did do kind of what I
Nice.
was wanting it to. But yeah, I really like a challenge. And so with my first book, the challenge was just like write a book. And with this
Yeah.
one, the challenge was more to do a structure and yeah, that sort of that pacing out. So yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, no, it was really well done because there's also this, when you read thrillers, you know that the reality that you're reading is not the reality of the story. But with Rufus and Calliope, we are in the reality of Rufus's story, right? Like we are in the reality of the story, and there is no other reality until we know, right? And that I think you did that brilliantly. It was really thoroughly enjoyable throughout. Never felt frustrated, always felt joy. It does anyone have any questions? I put it in the chat. I just have one more question about what you're writing right now. And we'll give you an opportunity to have the last word if you feel like I haven't covered something you really wanted to talk about. No questions, anybody? Okay, I want to talk about what you're working on right now. If you have anything that you want to share.
It's really early, so I can't say too much. And I keep saying that in interviews. I'll be like, oh no, now I've said too much. So I'm going to try to not this time. But I think again, because I do I find having a challenge really keeps me engaged with the process because, of course, it takes years to write a novel. So
Yeah.
I need to be super invested in the characters. I need to put a lot of things that really interest me. Like, for example, with this book, I've always loved tree houses and the idea of tree houses and living in a tree house. And so that was a real thing that pulled me through. But with the next one, without revealing, yeah, I think what I can say is I think there's gonna be three points of view in this one. So far, both
Okay.
my books have had a single person's point of view, but through different time periods.
Hmm.
And especially with Rufus and Calliope, I really played a lot with moving through time in quite short sections. I think I liked working with the short sections. I think it speaks to, this is including myself, I guess I'll say our modern attention span, maybe would
Yeah,
be the way to put it.
right.
But I think it's maybe more, especially as you know, I keep hearing that people are reading less and spending more time watching things. So I think the short bits appeal maybe yeah, to our modern sensibility in that way.
Mhm.
But yeah, I'm really interested in trying to write from a couple different points of view. And
Mhm.
I'm also hoping, and I don't know, I should ask more writers about this who've had the experience, but I'm hoping that what that will also do is let me put in more hours of writing because I have a little bit more time now for writing. I still
Yeah.
have a day job, and I've got a little bit more time than I did 5 years ago. And so I did start to wonder, like, if I get really mired down in a character, maybe I can just jump to another character. So
Yeah.
this is what I'm hoping. It's early on. I don't know yet if my plan is going to work, but I'm really hoping that this will be the case. So we'll
Yeah.
see. I'll report back.
Right. I love that. And I really do love multiple points of view because that it's kind of the same as Rufus and Calliope because there is like a kind of singular reality that isn't the reality for everybody
Mhm.
involved in the story. So I really like that when they all come together, there's like, oh, this is the
Yeah.
reality. This is what this person thought is actually not the reality. And so that I look forward to reading that.
Yeah, I love that too in books, but also the one thing that worries me is like, do you ever find that there's a point of view you prefer and you're kind of like, right? That can
Always.
happen where you're not rushing through, but sometimes kind of rushing through one point of view to get to the one that you're most invested in.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so I feel like that's going to be a bit of a challenge to try to
Yeah.
keep them all interesting. But also, I think there's also just the case that people are going to have preferences, and that's just the way it
Yeah.
is. So.
And it's always nice when the preferred perspective ends up being the one that's the most skewed, ends up being the one that
Mm.
you're like, oh man, I was really rooting for you, Barb.
Ah,
Why'd you
yeah,
mess that
yeah.
up? So that
Okay,
you're
that's a good point. I'll keep that in mind because you're
yeah,
right.
because if there is a character that you're rooting for and then at the end they're the one who messed everything up in the first place, you're like, what?
Yeah, yeah. Conflicted
Yeah.
feelings about the characters. Yeah, that can be
Yeah.
common.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. Do you have anything to say about Rufus and
Um,
Calliope? Are there any events, any other online events, in-person events, any other stuff you want to throw at people?
I think it's slowing down now.
Yeah.
So I've done quite a few like interviews and these sort of things. And I actually just less than 2 weeks ago, just got back from France
Oh, wow.
because the book came out in France. In both my books ended up getting um, translated into French, and Rufous and Calliope just came out there in February.
Oh, I
So I
love
was
that.
just there, yeah, just a couple weeks ago. So it's always interesting to see in different places the different questions people ask and different focus there. There was a lot of questions about just sort of the setting and,
Yeah,
being in this remote part of BC and all of that. And then around where I live, the questions are always about like, wait, was that supposed to be this place? Or like people
right.
trying to figure out where I was talking about. And so with this book, because that happened so much with my first, with this book, I actually included a note on geography
Right.
specifically
Yeah.
for people in my area. So basically just to say, don't drive yourself crazy trying to find these spots. Like I created a fictionalized version of the area. Like I used topo maps and I used all kinds of things, but it's not how it really is. So it would be impossible to map it onto the real world. So
Yeah. To find the treehouse.
yeah,
You're not
there are
gonna
a lot.
find the
Yeah,
treehouse. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you spending the time talking to me about this book. Everybody, I put a little thing of information where you can find and follow Sarah in the chat. Hopefully, you can see that there. And you can buy Rufus and Calliope from Douglas and McIntyre directly, or you can buy it from your favorite indie bookstore or your favorite local library. And Sarah, thank you so much. I really
yeah,
appreciate it.
yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay,
Yeah,
thanks
take care.
everybody. Thanks.